I'm Kris Sims filling in for Candice Malcolm here on the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you so much for watching and for listening to this show. We've got a great show for you lined up today. We're going to be speaking with my good friend, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terzano, and for a very specific reason, because all of the bureaucrats in Ottawa are apparently going to be spending their summer scurrying around with their hair on fire, saying they can't possibly find savings in the budget. They're cut marrow thin. They're down to the bone, folks. They have nowhere to cut. I'm old enough to remember when then Prime Minister Stephen Harper informed his ministers to find, I think it was between 5 and 8% savings within their departments, and the bureaucracy freaked out. Spoiler report, we've got about 100,000 more bureaucrats now, and their spending has gone through the roof. The numbers that are flowing around right now in Ottawa as far as spending on our bureaucracy would choke a horse. So be sure to tune in for that. I wanted to get into the element of accountability here, though, and it's really important to flag this. So I would recommend that people look this up in the National Post, read about it at Juno News and at True North and in online journalism. Check out Brian Lilly's column on this. And it is that, remember when Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's got a big CV, okay, to be fair, he's former governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada. The dude's got a PhD in economics. He's a business guy. He's got a very long CV and a very deep contact Rolodex. We get it. But remember how during the election, a lot of people were playing dumb, saying that Mark Carney couldn't possibly have any conflicts of interest? And to their credit, even the mainstream media during the election was asking then candidate for Prime Minister, Mark Carney, if he would see that he would have any potential conflicts of interest with businesses if he were to govern as Prime Minister. Remember what he said? Listen to this.
That those assets should be publicly disclosed within 120 days, which means you'll campaign in a coming federal election, most likely within the next 120 days, and are serving as Prime Minister now, with Canadians not being aware of what potential conflicts of interest you sought to avoid.
What possible conflict would you have, Stephanie? Stephanie, I'm complying with the rules. I'm complying with the rules in advance. Point final.
Yeah, that was not a good answer. And again, to a veteran reporter in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, he said, what possible conflicts would I have? And you might even remember, full disclosure, the CBC reporter, Rosemary Barton, commentator Rosemary Barton, asked him about this too. And Carney's response again was very odd and defensive of look inside yourself, Rosemary. It was a strange response during a very strange election campaign. The reason why this matters is because taxpayers are on the hook for this stuff. And Canadians at large require accountability from government. They need to know if their government is in a conflict of interest with any of the companies that are getting contracts that are getting paid with our tax dollars. Remember, folks, close to half of your money, okay, goes out the window to various levels of government in the form of taxes, levies, and fees. To do a thought process on that, imagine what lands in your, say you're on salary, okay? You've got a regular job that average people have, and you're on salary and you get your paycheck deposited in your bank account every 2 weeks. Imagine that amount being double what it actually is. What could you do with that money? Could you afford better food? Could you pay down your line of credit? Could you save up for a house? Could you get a better education for your kids? That's how much money various levels of government take. So you are absolutely right to demand transparency and accountability when it comes to where your money is going. This is where this is important. On Friday afternoon, the traditional time where all governments like to take out the trash. For those of us who've worked on Parliament Hill, who have ever worked in government as staffers, it's affectionately, sardonically referred to as Recycling Day. Who's got some recycling for today? Well, the thing that was pulled out to the curb on Friday afternoon was this. Turns out, Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to need a special screen set up between himself, his dealings, and any of the companies that he previously had connection to. Apparently, it's going to be in more than 100 instances. Check this out. Carney to recuse himself from dealings with over 100 companies in sprawling government conflict screen. Okay, that is super important. That's the headline from the National Post. Go read it. Go read that article, share it with your friends, keep it in mind as we deal with government going forward. Because again, you folks need to be informed citizens on this because this is all your money and we need to hold government to account regardless of party. Which leads me to another key issue here, and that is accountability and the Auditor General. So, folks might remember that the Auditor General plays a very clear role when it comes to counting beans, checking in on ethics violations, all that stuff, finding out where money is going, okay, how contracts are procured on Parliament Hill. The role of the Auditor General was really made famous, I would argue, during the so-called sponsorship scandal. For those of you who are kids who don't know what that is, go look that up. That's what eventually brought down the Liberal government and ushered in the Harper era, was the so-called sponsorship scandal or ad scam. Now, it's really important to key in on this because the Auditor General pointed something out quite recently, just a few weeks ago, and that is this. Apparently, bureaucrats in Ottawa have forgotten how to properly do up a contract, open it to public tender, and get ethical procurement of things. In normal people talk, what that means is the bureaucrats that you're paying on your taxpayer dime have forgotten their duty on how to properly give a contract to an outside agency without ethics violations. Listen to this.
Given the investigations you've done so far on McKinsey and GC strategies, do you have a sense at this point of how widespread these issues are in the public service?
Well, I can only speak to those two elements, and in both cases, the vendors represented a really small percentage of what was spent on professional services contracts by the federal government. But in the McKinsey work, we had looked at 10 Crown corporations and 10 departments. In this audit, there's 31 federal organizations, including one Crown and departments. And we found issues in almost every contract that we looked at, which tells me that there's no reason to believe it's limited to these two. And it's time for the public service to go back to the basics in understanding procurement rules and why they should be followed.
Understanding procurement rules and why they should be followed. For folks who haven't worked in government, again, on Parliament Hill particularly, there's the ministers, okay, who are elected members of Parliament, who are then appointed to cabinet as cabinet ministers. They have staff. They're often referred to as political staff. So you've got, people who are in strategy, people who are in stakeholder relations, communications professionals, etc. That's political staff. Next to that is the department, okay? The deputy minister is a bureaucrat, okay? They don't face election. They don't have to run for public office. They typically have a permanent job. Underneath that deputy minister is the entire department. There's communications people, like you name it. They're all under there, okay? Those people should know how to do procurement, okay? This should be just part of their DNA. Back when I was a staffer, telling tales out of school, I don't care. When I was a staffer, I specifically remember somebody from the ethics commissioner giving everybody a briefing, giving staff members a briefing, political staff a briefing. We were all communications types. And she basically said, if you go out for coffee with a reporter, like a journalist on Parliament Hill, don't accidentally take home their pen because I will consider that to be a gift that you will have to declare. I'm not kidding. So the idea that a permanent bureaucrat whose job it is to hand out taxpayers' money and to draw up contracts doesn't know how to do ethical procurement is a huge red flag. And it really speaks volumes. It shows you that it's no wonder we are spending money like crazy. Keep in mind, the ArriveCan app that most people loathe using and never really worked should have cost taxpayers around $250,000. Around that. It wound up costing taxpayers more than $60 million. That is one example of a huge screw up on Parliament Hill. And it's one example of why they cannot get their spending under control. And they have to get their spending under control. Otherwise, we're going to hit a debt interest crisis. Let's find out how much we need to save in order to balance the budget and start paying down the debt and avoid a huge debt interest crisis. How can we avoid this crisis? Let's find out. Joining me now is my good friend and federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terzano. Franco, he's stationed in Ottawa. I like to nickname it Mordor. I'm picturing what's going on right now, Franco, in relation to these so-called cuts. So in the middle of summer, the kids aren't in school, the MPs aren't sitting there, the leader of the Conservative Party doesn't have a seat. It feels like the phony war moment right now going in the Capitol from here. What's it like out there? Are the unions freaking out? Is Carney actually going to make the cuts that he needs to make?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot to dive into there, but Kris, like, look, you asked me if the union bosses are freaking out. I mean, come on. They are freaking out. They are fear-mongering over a spending review. Okay? Fear-mongering over a spending review. So here's what's going on. Look, Ottawa has been wasting money like crazy for more than a decade now, right? Like, look, back in like 2015, 2016, the federal government was spending around $290 billion. Well, last year, the federal government spent more than $500 billion. So even after accounting for inflation, you got spending up more than 40% in a decade. Okay, so Carney comes along. He's like, okay, we're going to do a spending review because like debt is spiraling out of control. And you've got the union bosses fear mongering, right? You know, calling this potential savings draconian rollbacks. Another union was talking about how it's going to hurt everyone in Canada who depends on vital public services. And my response to that is like, oh, really? Now government union bosses are worried about services? Really now? Right? After the federal government rubber stamped hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses, added tens of thousands of extra bureaucrats, handed out thousands of pay raises every single year. Now union bosses are worried about the services? Like, come on, folks. Like, if more government spending and more government bureaucrats meant better services, then there would be no potholes left in Canada, right? There would be no wait times in hospitals. Like, come on. After this bureaucrat hiring spree, all taxpayers really got out of this deal is just higher taxes and a bigger debt bill.
Yeah, because again, not to belabor it, we pay their wages. We pay their salaries. Taxpayers pay the wages for all of these government employees. You raised a very good point there. Some folks will be like, oh, well, it's essential. We need to nationalize everything. We need to have the government take care of us. Okay, let's go along with that line of logic. How's your healthcare doing?
Mm-hmm.
How's the passport office being run? How is Canada Post working out for you lately? Like, we're getting such crappy service coming from the federal government, and yet they don't want to actually make these cuts. How do we square this circle?
Well, here's another little stat I'm going to drop on you folks, okay? So since 2016, the cost of the bureaucracy has gone up 73%. Now ask yourself, I'm laughing because to ask the question is to answer it. Have you been getting anywhere close to 73% better services from the federal government? I mean, look, unless you're taking a taxpayer paycheck, that answer is a big fat no. I mean, here's another point, right? Like, you are now paying for 99,000 more federal bureaucrats today than you were just 10 years ago. Look, the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, has seen the second biggest increase in the number of bureaucrats. Are you even able to get a CRA bureaucrat on the phone? The answer is, of course not. We've got these union bosses that are fear mongering right now over what seems to be any potential savings. Look, I think the union bosses need to be upfront with their membership. And that is that the single biggest threat to a bureaucrat's paycheck, it's not political ideology, it's not a pressure campaign, it's interest charges on the debt. Okay, you want to know what will really cut healthcare transfers or will really cut the number of bureaucrats? It's not political ideology, it's interest charges. And interest charges on the debt are spiraling out of control.
Let's go there right now. I will also point out, this always blows me away whenever you raise this on the podcast. Am I correct in saying that the average pay, the average salary for the typical government employee is now over $100,000 federally per year?
Well, okay, the average compensation, when you look at the salary, the pension, the bonuses, the other types of perks, the average compensation for a federal bureaucrat is $125,000 a year. The average compensation, 125 grand. Hey, Kris, as you'll know, right, the federal government doesn't publish a sunshine list. Okay,
Yeah.
they do not proactively disclose the number of top earners that they have in the federal government, unlike the vast majority of provinces, by the way. However, your friends at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we filed an access to information request to find out, how many bureaucrats in the federal government are getting a six-figure base salary. Kris, this is going to blow your mind. There are 110,000 federal employees with a base salary of more than 100 grand. 110,000 employees, okay? That means about 1/3 of the entire federal bureaucracy gets a six-figure base salary.
Brutal. Absolutely brutal. So, folks, when you're thinking about this, okay, and you're thinking about half your paycheck disappearing in taxes, levies, and fees, okay, to various levels of government, remember what Franco just said. About 1/3 of the employees at the federal government level, you just said make over six figures, make over 100 grand.
Yeah, salary.
Brutal.
Salary.
Absolutely brutal. Okay, let's get into the debt interest because
Yeah.
I'll be upfront. I think a lot of people don't like thinking about the federal debt because they don't like thinking about their own debt. A lot of people are fighting to afford basics right now. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're within $200 every month of not being able to make the minimum payments on things like their car, their rent, and yes, their debts. But here's the issue, folks. We have to think about it because otherwise the politicians will refuse to and they won't fight it. And we're all the ones paying the interest on this darn thing. So, Franco, get into it for us. How much is the debt right now? And how much is the interest payment on the debt costing taxpayers?
Well, the debt is more than $1.2 trillion, which is crazy because fast forward back to 2015 and the debt was about $600 billion. So in less than a decade, the Trudeau government doubled the national debt, which means that your kids and your grandkids are going to be making payments on that debt for the rest of their lives. But of course, it's not just the debt, right? The sum total that you have to be worried about, because the interest charges alone on the debt are astronomically high. Okay, so interest charges on the debt are costing taxpayers about $55 billion a year. Okay, which means that interest charges are blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week. Now, let's give some context to that, okay? That's a brand new hospital that isn't getting built every week because that money's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street to pay interest on the debt. Or let's put it like two other ways here, okay? Last year, the federal government spent more money on interest charges than it sent to the provinces in health transfers, okay? That's how crazy it's getting. Or think about it this way. Welcome to Canada, where every dollar you pay in federal sales tax goes to pay interest on the debt. So to really sum it up, think what we could do without this massive debt, okay? We could nearly double health transfers, or we could essentially eliminate the entire federal sales tax.
Picture that, folks. And imagine, Franco, you made a good point there about $1 billion hospital and not being built. Perhaps a stronger visualization is, okay, everybody gather around every Saturday evening. We're going to stand around a brand new hospital, shiny, new paint, nobody's inside of it yet. Burn it down. Every single week.
Yeah.
That's just the interest on the debt. Burn down that new hospital structure every single week. This is madness, and this is where we're spiraling to. Now, I'm old enough to recognize this movie. I've seen this movie before. And that's actually when the Canadian Taxpayers Federation got started. Back in 1990, people were super ticked off about the GST. You just mentioned the GST. They were super ticked off about the huge debt, okay? And the deficits and the interest payments. Do you think we are hitting that wall? Because regardless of color of the team jersey, okay, it was the red team actually. It was Paul Martin who said that damn clock, the debt clock, we've got to slay this deficit. We have to balance the budget. Do you think we're coming around to that moment again, regardless of who's in? Do you think Carney has the chops to say, you know what, we got to put the brakes on this spending spree?
I'm glad you brought up the point about the early 90s. And what's that old saying? Like, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
Right. I think we're getting to that part of the song again. You know what I mean? But look, and let me just bring back the point I made earlier, where it's that these union bosses need to be honest with their membership, because it's not really political ideology that will lead to nurses getting fired, teachers getting fired, or hospitals getting closed down. It's debt interest charges, right? And that's what happened in the 90s. Look, you brought up the Liberals in Ottawa that made spending cuts, right? The red team. And also, Kris, in your backyard in Alberta, you had the PCs, the Klein government that, saved people money, cut spending, held up that paid in full sign in the summer of 2004, right? I reminisce about those days. But also the Orange team in Saskatchewan in the 90s, right? With the finance minister, Janice McKinnon at the time. What did they have to do? Because the massive interest charges, how much it costs for the government to borrow money. Well, they had to close what? Like 50 hospitals across that prairie province. So this kind of goes back to the whole point that we're making. Look, either the federal government under Mr. Carney, either they roll up their sleeves and they find some savings today, or big time spending cuts are going to be forced on them tomorrow. And Kris, to segue back to the first part of this conversation, you asked me, is Carney really making cuts? Well, look, I actually don't even think he's going to bring down total spending. Okay, everything that I've heard from the Carney government is that debt is still going to go up. And yes, they're going to try to find savings in some areas of the budget, but they're going to compensate that, so to speak, with higher spending elsewhere. So the only thing that I can see from the Carney government, based on what has been tabled before us today, is that they will find some savings around the edges, but really overall spending is still going to go up, maybe just not as fast as it did under the Trudeau era.
I want you to debunk a couple of things here for viewers here of the Candice Malcolm Show. Often we'll hear Prime Minister Carney say things to the Parliamentary Press Gallery like, oh, I'm going to cut spending. It's going to be investing. It's government. Like, it's not like he's taking his own money or, harvesting from an orchard of money trees. It's still government spending, right? Like, is there a difference? Is there a difference between operational spending and capital spending? Is there a difference between government spending and what they're calling investing here?
Okay, so you're so right to say that every single dollar, whether they call it spending, investing, throwing the money out of a window, every single dollar is still taxpayers' money. And all of that money over and above the revenue you take in, that's more money added to the debt, more money wasted on debt interest charges. Now, look, Kris, I can tell you, look, I just bought a 24-pack of Canadian, but don't worry, it was an investment. You know what I mean? Like, so a lot of it also depends on what they decide to classify as operating spending versus capital spending. Now, obviously, what we're worried about at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is we're worried about accounting trickery, right? Oh, they might cut some operating spending, but what they're really doing is just changing the title and then calling it capital spending, right? So it's really hard to tell in an objective way what is actually operating versus what is capital spending, other than what the government just wants to use as different labels. Look, can you make the case that some type of capital might have long-term impact? Yes, maybe. Okay, but it's still more money going out the window. And I would say this, instead of just reorganizing or relabeling what different types of spending is, we should see overall spending going down. Okay, because after the last 10 years of out of control runaway borrowing, look, finding savings in every area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean.
Two more questions for you. One, do our creditors care? Like the bond fund managers on Bay Street, like you often say, do they care if this is capital spending or operational spending, or is this just a bottom line of going into deeper debt?
Oh, they absolutely will care if all of that extra spending means more debt. Right. So they will totally care if like all of this new budgeting still means more debt. Right. And here's where the problem is. Even during the election where Carney was saying he's going to split the budget into operating capital. Well, if you actually look at his numbers, Carney wants to add $225 billion to the debt over the next 4 years. $225 billion. Folks, let's put that into context. Over those years, Trudeau wanted to add about $131 billion to the debt. Okay, so Carney is planning on adding about $100 billion more to the debt than even what Trudeau was planning to add, right? The banker, supposed to be better with the numbers than the drama teacher, but the banker is adding almost $100 billion more debt than what even Trudeau was planning to do. So you ask me, will they care? Of course they will care if we're already more than $1 trillion in debt. And then over the next 4 years, the federal government adds $225 billion to that tab.
Okay, last question, and I think it might be one of our favorite questions that we get at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is, okay, tough guy, where do you want to cut first? Do you want to cut, gruel budget for orphans? Or do you want to cut hip replacements for little old ladies? Like, there's so much waste that you and I cover and all of our team covers at the Taxpayers Federation. I get so mad that I feel like just cutting government by like 80%. See which wheels fall off. Then I'll actually care about adding things back on to this clown car. But in all seriousness, where can he find savings? Where can he cut? Are there some big cuts that he could make that would instantly balance this budget?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's talk about the small things, okay? The infuriating examples of waste. I don't know. Maybe don't spend $8 million building a barn on the Governor General's estate. Like, Kris, I don't know about the first thing about farming, but my buddies back at Brooks could build a barn for a lot less than $8 million, right? Or how about this? I don't know. Call me old-fashioned, but maybe we don't need to spend $8,800 on a sex toy show in Germany titled "Whose Jizz Is This?" right?
I knew you were gonna say that.
Yeah, I did it for you. Or I don't know, 12 grand outsourcing old people sex stories in other countries, right? The government spent 12 grand so seniors in other countries can talk about their sex lives in front of live audiences in other countries. So look, there's the small examples of waste. The big examples though, like, look, there is no way to balance the budget, to fix the budget and cut taxes without firing bureaucrats. There's no way. There's no way around it. Okay, because the federal government added 99,000 bureaucrats in a decade. Okay, now more than half of the government's day-to-day spending is consumed by the bureaucracy. In fact, look, if the government just increased the bureaucracy to stay in line with population growth over the last 10 years, we would be saving $7 billion a year. So the big place to cut is the bureaucracy. I'll give you one more area that the government must cut, and it's another big one. Corporate welfare. Hey, how about this? How about you let people and businesses keep more of their own money rather than hiking taxes on Canadians and Canadian entrepreneurs and then turning around and giving buckets of cash to multinational corporations, right? Like the government put taxpayers on the hook for like $30 billion to multinational corporations like Honda, Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Northvolt. So look, there's a bunch of the small waste that we could talk about the entire show, but the two big items that they have to really tackle is the bureaucracy and then just completely ending corporate welfare. And to grow the economy, how about you cut taxes, cut regulations, and get out of the way?
You've got so many stats. Just 1 second. Did you just say that if the feds had kept spending in line with population growth, they'd save $7 billion a year?
No. I was only talking about the bureaucracy. Right. So yeah. So only the bureaucracy, like
silly me.
Yeah. You're giving them too much credit. No. Like, folks, if think about it this way, the bureaucracy grew out of control so wildly that if they just allowed the bureaucracy to grow in line with population growth, and you know how much Canada has grown over the last 10 years, then we would save about $7 billion a year just by keeping bureaucracy growth in line with population growth. $7 billion a year.
I work with him every day, folks, and he still continues to amaze me. Franco Terzano, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining the Candice Malcolm Show.
Hey, that was fun. We should do this more often.
You bet. That's it for the Candice Malcolm Show for today. Thank you so much for listening and for watching. Be sure to share this show with your like-minded friends. If you've got red-pilled friends or friends who need to swallow a bottle of red pills and wake up to the fact of government corruption, government waste, understanding that we need independent journalism in Canada, please share this show with them. And make sure you subscribe to Juno News. Why? Because it is fundamental to a free press. we cover stuff from a direction that other media outlets won't dare to tread. So head on over to junonews.com, get your subscription, and spread the word.